It's my honor to start this conference. Ladies and gentlemen and non-binaries, on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Maastricht University, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conference on EMI, ICLHE, and Englishization, reflecting on the changing university. For those who don't know me, I'm René Gabriels, the conference chair. You are now not only in the second oldest, founded by the Romans, and first industrialized city in the Netherlands, but also look around you, the oldest gym in the Netherlands. The great transgender persons you see on the ceiling here remind us that the first gym exercises were performed in this room as early as 1880. And if Dutch would be the medium of instruction, you would be able to read at the end beautiful poems by famous poets in the front of the room. But I don't want to bother you any longer with cultural historical reflections on the place where you will discuss all kinds of aspects of especially English medium of instruction today and in the coming days. Given the abstracts submitted by the participants, I'm convinced that it will be a very interesting conference. The abstracts testify that research into the integration of content and language in higher education and EMI has undergone significant development in recent years. While the previous research mainly focused on the opportunities and challenges that EMI programs all over the world pose within the university, the emphasis is now more on the consequences of it for the non-academic world. Against this background, fascinating research is now being conducted into the relationship between three levels at which Englishization takes place. The micro level of everyday research and education at a faculty, the meso level of the university and immediate environment, and the macro level of the nation state and the global context. What happens in the classroom cannot be viewed in isolation from broad developments in the world, and it is therefore good to look not only at the academic world, but also beyond. Will Englishization widen the gap between the academic and non-academic world? What are the consequences of Englishization for a country's culture, assuming that L1 is an important, if not the most important feature of a country's cultural identity? Is it bad if, for instance, Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Swedish, German, and French disappear as academic languages? Does Englishization lead to a cleft between Englishized students and scholars who can move around the world as nomads and socially less disadvantaged students and scholars who are confined to their own state or region? Is the fact that the opportunities to follow EMI programs are not equal within and between countries a matter of linguistic injustice? Anyone who wants to answer these questions and the questions raised in the abstracts you have written will also have to consider the second part of the title of the conference, Reflecting on the Changing University. What does reflecting on the changing university entail? There's no doubt that the university has changed a lot due to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism transformed the classical university into an entrepreneurial university. The entrepreneurial university is characterized by the commodification of education and research. As a result, the classical Homo academicus has made way for students and scholars who increasingly have the habitus of a Homo economicus, who know how to capitalize the acquisition and transfer of knowledge. Reflecting on the changing university implies a critical look at the neoliberal push towards Englishization that this development of higher education implies. With the consequences of neoliberalism on higher education, research into EMI, ICLHE, and Englishization pays particular attention to the consequences that the allocation of a resource such as language has for the quality of education, culture identity, inequality, and the opportunities to express concern about this. It is remarkable that despite the great differences between countries, the theme of the conference is all over the world an issue. Universities across the world offer EMI programs, but they do so in their own way. Scholars from 35 countries participate in this conference. I'm very curious about the differences and also similarities between these countries when it comes to your research on ICLHE, EMI, and Englishization, and I expect to learn a lot from you. The findings of your research presented at this conference are not only of academic interest, but also of interest to those responsible for language policy at all levels. I don't expect you to do gym exercises in this lecture hall or other rooms during this conference like these great transgender persons on the ceiling, but to have lively discussions about your interesting research. I wish you a fruitful conference on a relevant topic and hope you have a pleasant stay in Maastricht. Welcome. I will hand over to Bob Wilkinson, who also wants to say a few words to you. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. No, sorry, I'll begin again. Good morning, colleagues and friends. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Maastricht University. René has already pointed out the history and the eloquence of this building. I will leave that for a minute, but I would like to give a special welcome to all the participants who are online all over the world. Welcome especially to all of you who've traveled far to get here from places like Indonesia, Singapore, Japan, India, Brazil, and Chile, and of course, all of those of you who've come from much nearer at home. And a special welcome for those who've not traveled far from Bunde, Ambi, and Rekem. On behalf of ICLHE, I'm most grateful to the university and the faculty for hosting the 7th conference. And I would like at this point to pay a special personal thanks to René Gabriels, to the Department of Philosophy, to the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, to the university, and to our president who is here, Rian Leclerc, for allowing me to continue all these years when I should have been put out to graze many, many years ago. Since I shall now be stepping down as chair of ICLHE, it's fitting to look back on, or at least very briefly, on the role of the university and the association. The ideas for a conference focusing on the changing language of instruction emerged on the margins of LSP symposia in the early 1990s. I would like to say a special word of thanks to my colleague in Oslo, Glenn Ole Hellekia, for his keen insights at that time. The first conference took place at this university 19 years ago and attracted scholars from across the world, even though we, as the organizers, had initially aimed at Europe and more particularly only Northern Europe. The challenges of education through an additional language was a worldwide phenomenon, even then. The challenges have remained and indeed spread not only further, but also to a much wider sphere than simply education. Now they affect societies as a whole, impacting on identity, culture, democracy, and justice. It's a great pleasure to see speakers at this conference addressing both sets of challenges, the educational and the societal. Thank you all. I wish you a fruitful conference. May I now invite our president, Rian Letchurch to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the university.
It's a nice spot here in the sun. Dear audience, dear all, it's an amazing place to be here in this sunny morning light. You are lucky that this is the week that you organize your conference. Next week it will be Dutch weather again, I'm afraid. It's a real pleasure for me to be here this morning when Bob and Renee ask you to come and open a conference. You actually never say no as university administrator. Not only because they're so gentle, but also because they always know how to convince you that it's important to take into account the findings of their academic research. And that's, of course, we are an academic institution. So for any policy that we develop, it is important to take into account the academic research that is out there. And they know always in a very gentle, respectful way to approach the university administrators also before I was here, and to make them aware how important that is. So on a personal note, thank you so much also for reaching out to me, both when I was rector and now in my role as president, because that's very helpful. So continue also doing that. I know they will, by the way, because by now I know them. Okay, everyone. It's great to see also so many international participants. From what I learned, it's 35 different countries. After 2 years of COVID being stuck behind screens, I think this is what we all need to be able to really have a dialogue with each other. And even though people are also in the online environment, which is also quite helpful that that's possible nowadays, I do like very much the physical interaction that we can have during these conferences. Now, it is no surprise that since Englishization, and I hate that word, and I learned also that last night you talked about that word, Englishization. It's a difficult word in itself. It's a global phenomenon, and more scientific research is being done on all continents, and opportunities like these here this week to compare and to discuss your findings will definitely enrich the conversation around language policy tremendously. And we need that also in our country and also at our university. Now, while we may be a very young university, 45 years, so that's, if you compare it to other Dutch universities, we're the youngest university, and we're proud to be that. We do have quite a long history with English medium instruction, and not only as a good host, but also as a case study, like your case study you're doing at the moment. Now, what you're looking at is, of course, a larger trend that has greatly accelerated in the last 20 years or so. And I think that internationalization is quite a popular keyword, just as English medium instruction is in most contexts. And language, as you know, better than me as academic experts in this area, is a delicate issue. So I'm happy to see so many of you here today to look critically at the many different contexts from which we can learn for the future. Now, especially in the field of education, I don't think we can put aside the question of whether knowledge transfer becomes less effective if neither the professor nor the student speak their first language. And also whether this matters more in subjects that rely on verbal equity and nuance rather than on formulas and clearly quantifiable observations. Now, I come from law. I studied Dutch law, and there having instruction in Dutch is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it would have been really difficult to study that field of law. Later, I moved to international law, and that was in English, which was also logical, looking at that field in particular. Now, if we think in words, and maybe we don't, you tell me, but if we do, then with the language we use to make sense of the world will circumscribe our possible sphere of knowledge. Now, of course, you can clearly define colors in terms of nanometers or terahertz, but the delineation is to some extent quite arbitrary. So how many colors you distinguish and where exactly you draw the line between them is rooted in culture and of course subculture. And one would assume that painters and interior designers have a more granular perception of color, and with that, a much more extensive and specific vocabulary. Now, the question here, though, is whether English medium instruction grants advantages to English native speakers. And I just learned I couldn't use the term native anymore. Bob will talk about that maybe later. But whether it grants advantages to English native speakers when it comes to acquiring, but also generating knowledge. And correspondingly, the question, are there types of knowledge that are more prone to being filtered out simply because they are less suitable to be rendered in English? The question is then also about perception of fairness. Now, deciding on a language of instruction bestows importance and also prestige on that language. And the same is also true for a state's official languages. Does teaching in English at the expense of a local language necessarily diminish the status of that language? Does it affirm the elevated status of English beyond its usefulness as a lingua franca? And by promoting English in the classroom and also in an administrative context, as we do also at this university, still being a bilingual university, universities do try to be inclusive, to open up to the world. And yet we should still look closely at who might struggle, who might feel excluded or alienated, and how. And that is at this very moment also the discussion we have at our university. We claim to be a bilingual university where you may choose the preferred language, but we also see a shift more and more towards the use of English, whereas some parts of our staff feel less included, who don't master the use of English as well as their other colleagues. And in particular, we see that also in certain areas of our support staff communities who also would like to see, what is this bilingual identity then? And what does it mean for me to be able to use my Dutch language in meetings that are composed of different nationalities? That are questions that we talk about almost on a weekly basis, not only in the meetings, but also with our participatory bodies. Now, we should therefore also look at the wider implications of promoting a lingua franca, knowing that everyone in their small language community also speaks English very well, and that their own language is more and more saturated with Anglicism. Will the poets of that community, for instance, also switch to English? And I know tonight you will have a speaker who has a fascinating view also on in particular also this topic. And if they do, how would it change their poems and what they could hope to say to and about their community? And what plurality of words, ideas, and nuances could we lose? And what role might higher education then play in these dynamics? Whether one is more delighted by the advantages or worried by the trade-offs will depend on the pragmatic considerations around one's role, but also on one's personal predisposition. And the concerns around the issue certainly go well beyond the classroom and challenge us all to address the issue of identity. Now, the pragmatic approach would be to focus less on the emotions surrounding English medium instruction, important though they are, and focus maybe instead on the real world effects it has. Now, I'm very happy to also learn from Bob and René that you have responded to that very intricate question. And it certainly is not easy to tease apart the effects of English medium instruction from the larger developments whereof it is a corollary. From the cultural dominance of the USA to the changing nature of news provision or publishing. And I'm well aware that the implementation and impact of higher education policies varies considerably, not only across countries and language communities, but also on a local level. And I think it's very instructive to look at the reasoning behind, as well as the nature of the rapid Englishization, and also the tensions and polemics surrounding this development. Now, in the Netherlands, we tend to have changing guidelines from the ministry, but there are liberties and accordingly considerable differences in the outcomes at different universities. And I'm sure the same is true everywhere regarding anything from teaching methods to approaches to inclusion or recruitment, all the way to the actual idiom employed on the ground. Now, maybe our situation at Maastricht is a good example of balancing the tensions between the global push and pull and the local particularities that we have here as well. Even without the university, the city of Maastricht now, as well as historically, is heavily influenced by the proximity to German and French-speaking regions. Accordingly, local linguistic peculiarities are not just limited to the English language. One might even go as far as arguing that the importance of English has helped elevate the local dialect rather than Dutch as the language expressing local identity. At the same time, we also see that the growth of English has had a detrimental effect on French and German language education. Now, of course, every case will be unique, but we can learn as much from these similarities as from the differences. Now, especially also against the backdrop of current geopolitical developments, we should also consider those who move, not out of ambition or preference, but out of sheer necessity. So I'm also pleased to see you have a very topical session on the impact on refugees and migrants. Now, all of these considerations make language policy a very delicate matter and something that I, as a university president, take very seriously. I would be amiss if I didn't take a second also here to share also my personal views on the matter. And some might deem them strong, but people know me by now. But I hold them loosely, and I'm always keen to take on board new information and perspectives coming out also of academic research that you're doing yourself. First of all, I passionately believe in diversity and inclusivity. I'm also under no illusion how difficult it is in practice. However, just because an ideal is impossible to reach does not mean that striving for it is less worthwhile. After all, failing to understand each other is not merely only a linguistic phenomenon. It is much deeper than that. And the most eloquent rhetoricians can fail to see each other's perspectives, be it through diverging core assumptions or through plain bad faith. In my view, the most striking upside of diversity is not aesthetic, but it is also pragmatic. It allows us to use the greatest feasible variety of perspectives to solve the big societal problems that concern us all. And we need to hear as many voices and reach as many people as we can, however imperfectly, to tackle those problems together. So accordingly, I'm inherently suspicious of any attempts to use language as an obstacle, a mechanism to keep out those from different backgrounds, those with different ideas. So to come together, we need an inclusive space where everyone can contribute and grow. And linguistically, that space is, for a variety of somewhat problematic historical reasons, English. Now, in order to exchange ideas in a lingua franca, we need to empower participants from a wide variety of cultural and linguistic backgrounds to contribute what is uniquely theirs. This is a substantial challenge if taken seriously, for make no mistake, a room full of international students, as we have in Maastricht, recruited from the elites of many different countries, but all speaking to some extent perfect English and sharing sometimes a homogeneous Anglo-centric worldview, is not the way forward. Internationalization makes sense only if it is combined with the preservation of linguistic and cultural diversity. For embedded in those cultures and languages are values, ideas, Weltanschauungen, my German is also very good, that allows us, that allow us to better understand and solve complex problems. And there's a price to pay for that. But in this context, I think it is really worth paying. And of course, it really would be much, much, much easier for me to address a conference of Dutch speakers. but that would also deprive us of the diversity of perspectives and insights that are going to be presented here today. But I promise you, my Dutch is much more eloquent than my English is. At least I think I can say that. On that note, I do want to stress again that your work is really important, also for us as university administrators, because the research that you have, the research results that you have obtained, the insights that you share, and the conclusions you might agree on will eventually be put on my desk. And I know you will also, after this week, give me the conference summary, because that will in turn shape the experience of countless of students and thus the society as a whole. And all conferences ideally are about learning from each other, but this particular conference, I would say, is also about how we learn from each other and the difficulties and implications of doing so across language barriers. Now, I think this is very momentous and also very exciting, in particular also if you look at all the fierce discussions on the use of English medium instruction and what we lose if we push that too much and what we gain if we provide that with a high level quality. So from my side, I will close. I wish you all a wonderful day and also hopefully some time to experience this beautiful city where you will hear all sorts of languages, wherever you go, to a coffee bar, to a store. So I hope you will have some time to also enjoy that. And everyone who has joined online, of course, I hope you will also have a very stimulating and fruitful conference. And to Bob and Renee, thank you again very much for having me here. I will be sitting in the back for some 15 more minutes, and then I will have to leave. That's part of the bad side of my job, that I never get to stay the whole conference. But again, you've promised me to give me the results of your conference, and that will also help develop Maastricht University's policies to a next level. So thank you all very much for being here and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. Just before I introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to make a couple of announcements that are important. But I have to put my glasses on because otherwise I can't read them. ICLHE is an association, offers a PhD presentation prize for a number of people. And this involves all of you, because you can all vote for the PhD students. Some of our colleagues have invented a wonderful system, thank you Annette, thank you Uta, to enable this to happen. And the awards will be announced at the close of the conference. But it's important to note there are 6 candidates up for the award, and you can go to their sessions and you can vote for them, and everybody online can also vote for them. But you have to assess their presentations. It doesn't matter if one gets 200 people voting in that way or another one only gets 5. We take the average. Okay, the candidates are Irene Soriano Flores, who is today at 1400 hours, Anne Nguyen, who's also today at 1400 hours, Rona Lohan on Wednesday, that's today, is it 1600 hours, Michelle Hunter, also today at 1715, Anne Nguyen for a second time, also second presentation, on Thursday at 1400, Verena Grau on Thursday at 1600, and Hoa Ke Tang on Friday at 9 o'clock. And please enjoy those sessions. My second announcement is very brief. Susanna Wasinski's second talk today at 17:15 is cancelled. Okay. Now. Oh, that's clever. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Kristina Hultgren, who is Professor of Sociolinguistics and Applied Linguistics at the Open University in the UK. And there's a problem. Oh. Oh. Okay. Well, this is to cut out the sun from the speaker's eyes. Okay.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Kristina Hultgren is also a UK Future Leaders Fellow at the Open University. She is well known to researchers in our field, and she's currently the lead principal investigator in a major multinational project investigating the emergence of EMI in European higher education from a political science and policy perspective. And it's a project in which this university is participating. Also, the University of Vienna and Complutense, because I see them both represented here, so I shouldn't forget them. Kristina Hultgren is a prolific producer of academic research. If you haven't yet read her work, please do. The latest, actually, it's probably not the latest, but the latest that I know is one called New Understandings of the Rise of English as a Medium Instruction in Higher Education, the Role of Key Performance Indicators and Institutional Profiling, which was published in the International Journal of Sociology of Language just recently, and it concerns an investigation of this university. With no further ado, I will invite Kristina up to the podium to address you. How do you get this on? The screen's shut out.
That's right.
I can also log in with my own. Let's do it. That's the best way. It's yours. On this box. Such a long passage, but it takes some time.
A long password.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh, out of range. No. So I guess we have to look again for your stick.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Renee. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Bob, for that kind introduction. It's an absolute honor to have been asked to open this seventh instantiation of this well-established conference series. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for the incredible amount of work that I know they've put in to bring us all together here in the beautiful city of Maastricht, and also with delegates joining in from across the world. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the reason why we're all here at this conference. And that is not the food, not even the drinks, but the indisputable fact that there has been a huge rise in English as a medium of instruction over the past few decades in Europe and beyond. So the key question that I'll be focusing on in this presentation is, why has this happened? It's a simple question with a rather more complex answer. And you may think that we already know why this happens, but in this presentation, I'm going to propose a slightly different take on it. And specifically, I'm going to zoom in on the role of the nation state as an active instigator of a set of reforms that have swept across the higher education sector and radically reconfigured the ways in which higher education institutions are governed. Specifically, I'll be arguing that the introduction of steering tools such as key performance indicators, institutional profiling, and formula funding have indirectly, well, all of which are predicated on a neoliberal philosophy of enhancing the competition in the sector, have indirectly led to the rise of English. Okay, so the work I'm going to present here is part of a project called English as a Medium of Instruction in European Higher Education, Challenges and Opportunities for Europe and the UK. And the main goal of this project is to shed new light on the drivers of English as a medium of instruction by approaching this question in a more interdisciplinary way. Specifically, we'll be bringing together conceptual tools from linguistics and political science, as well as fields such as higher education studies, public administration, and organizational studies. And I'd like to thank the funders, the UK Research and Innovation, for funding this work under a UK RI Future Leaders Fellowship with a quite generous pot of money, 1.4 million British pounds. Well, at least that's what it was worth before Liz Truss became UK Prime Minister. Could be around £20 now. Anyway, the project runs for around 4 years, or for 4 years, and we're about halfway through. So we're beginning to see some emerging findings that I'm delighted to be able to share with you today. So this is very much teamwork, and here are some of the incredible people that I work with in my team. I've got 4 full-time postdocs, Marion Now, Peter Wingrove, Dogan Yüksel, and Beatrice Suaro, and then I've got my 4 advisors, Ute Smith, Emma Dafoes, Bob Wilkinson, and my political scientist, Derek Beach, as well as my 3 stakeholder organizations, the British Council, the Academic Cooperation Association, and the European Students' Union. So the aim of the work that we do is to illuminate the role of higher education governance reforms and the introduction of performance-enhancing steering tools in driving English in universities in non-English dominant countries in Europe. Why is this important? Why should we care about this? This is the big so what question. You may think we already know why universities teach in English. It's to do with internationalization. It's to do with the Bologna Declaration. It's to do with intensified cross-border competition and collaboration and so on. Well, this is no doubt all true, okay? But in this project, we're trying to dig a little bit deeper using interdisciplinary approaches. And I'll give you 4 reasons why I think this interdisciplinary approach is important. Firstly, attributing the rise of English to factors such as internationalization, the Bologna Declaration, and other supranational drivers, as most of the existing literature tends to do, does not really explain why these things themselves happen. So why is it that universities and nation states all of a sudden feel compelled to internationalize, to compete for students, for funds, for prestige, and for rankings? By bringing political science, and particularly the focus on governance, states, and institutions into play, we're able to zoom in on the nation state as an active player in reforming the higher education sector and potentially indirectly driving English. That's what we hypothesize, at least. I think that this can empower us as enfranchised citizens because we all have the right to vote in our respective nation states. A second reason why an interdisciplinary approach is important is that current explanations have not managed to appease those who are concerned about the growth of English. English is known to cause heated debates across the continent. So in the Netherlands, for instance, the association Beter Onderwijs Nederland, Better Education Netherlands, filed and eventually lost a lawsuit against this very university here, Maastricht University, and also the University of Twente, demanding them to reintroduce Dutch as a medium of instruction because they thought that otherwise Dutch would become a provincial language. And there are many similar lawsuits and debates in other countries across Europe. There's a bit of a disconnect, however, between these vocal and sometimes passionate debates in public circles and the activities that happen in higher education governance and academic governance, where English is often seen as absolutely indispensable for attracting international student and staff, climbing university ranking lists, enhancing institutional prestige, and so on and so forth. So by bringing these different stakeholders into dialogue, we're hoping to actually enhance understanding and engage these people in knowledge exchange. And a third reason why we need an interdisciplinary approach is to better understand linguistic injustice and inequality. As has already been mentioned, there's a lot of debate about this, with concerns centered on threats to linguistic diversity, cultural and epistemic homogenization, educational and professional disadvantage, societal and geopolitical inequality. So by reorienting attention in our project to those who actually make decisions about these things, rather than those who are at the receiving end of it, we hope to offer a better understanding of how this linguistic injustice actually comes about, and perhaps also which might give us a better chance of actually redressing it. And the fourth and final reason why we want to find out about the drivers in an interdisciplinary way is more theoretical. So we're trying to identify fundamental principles that drive language shifts. And we're asking big and fundamental questions such as why English, or indeed any language, spreads across the world. We do know a bit about this, of course, not least from the sociolinguistics of globalization, but what is the role of the nation state in actually driving this shift? This is something that has been subject to less scrutiny. Okay, so what do we already know about the global spread of English? Well, because this is the opening talk of this conference, I thought it might be useful to give just a brief overview of this. John O'Regan, in his recent book, Global English and Political Economy, usefully groups work on the global spread of English into 4 categories: the anti-imperialist stance, the post-colonial, post-structuralist stance, the English as a lingua franca, world English stance, and the Marxist stance. And in the next few slides, I'll give a couple of examples of each approach, which will give us a sense of the recent evolution of the field. So let's start with the anti-imperialist stance. Robert Philipson is perhaps one of the best known proponents of this stance. Philipson argues that the spread of English is a form of linguistic imperialism, and he sees this as a sign of power, traditionally military power, but also in the modern world, economic and political power. To Philipson, it's not only the language that is transferred, but also the associated culture. And one example, of course, is the spread of American popular culture around the world. In his 1992 book, Philipson defines linguistic imperialism as the dominance of English asserted and maintained by the establishment and continuous reconstitution of structural and cultural inequalities between English and other languages. Another example of an anti-imperialist stance to global English is the concept of linguistic human rights. This is mostly associated with Tovis Gutnapkangas, Robert Philipson's professional and matrimonial partner. Linguistic human rights is motivated by a desire to combat linguistic discrimination in the face of a powerful language, often English. It's been defined around 3 pillars: the right to positive identification with the mother tongue and possibility to practice it freely, the right to learn the mother tongue and to use it in many of the official contexts, and the right to learn at least one of the official languages of the country of residence. The linguistic human rights concept has been very influential at high-level policy. So, for instance, UNESCO's policy to promote mother tongue education in post-colonial societies where English is often used. Moving on now from the anti-imperialist to the post-colonial or post-structuralist stance, Christopher Stroud was not happy with the concept of linguistic human rights because he believed that this promoted an arbitrary, essentialist and artificial view of language and ethnicity that does not cohere with how speakers actually use language on the ground. So the idea of the mother tongue, for instance, which was key to the linguistic human rights paradigm, or is key, would be considered problematic because in many multilingual societies, people often have many mother tongues and it's not clear which is the mother tongue. Speakers also use lots of varieties, different languages, typically featuring a lot of mixing and hybridity and non-standard language. So Stroud believed that the concept of linguistic human rights was too top-down and too managerialist because it picked out one certain language that would be worthy of promoting in a way that wasn't particularly democratic. So he coined instead the concept of linguistic citizenship, which emphasized grassroots communicative practices, and which he believed would be a more democratic way of promoting linguistic justice. Linguistic citizenship then aims to make visible the sociolinguistic complexity of language issues and to promote the idea of language as a political and economic site of struggle, alongside respect for diversity and difference and the deconstruction and essentialist understandings of language and identity. The post-colonial, post-structuralist stance has many affinities with the world Englishes and English as a lingua franca paradigm, which has also argued for democratizing English. Cattrew, for instance, in his world Englishes paradigm, argued that Indian, Singaporean, Chinese, and other varieties of English were equally valid varieties and not some form of broken English. This is obviously common knowledge to us here, but because this talk will be made available to a wider audience, I think it's a point that bears repeating. The founding mothers of the English as a lingua franca paradigm similarly argued that because non-native speakers, and I use the term non-native advisedly here, have now significantly outnumbered native speakers, English is just as much their or our language. Yeah? So this means that non-native speakers of English have just as much rights to define norms and standards and what should be considered correct and not correct. In other words, English as a lingua franca scholars would argue that it doesn't matter if you forget to add an S to your single present tense verbs, third person singular verbs, right? So just forget about all you've been taught in your English grammar lessons, okay? As long as you're able to make yourself understood, that's fine. I would probably say that most of my esteemed colleagues in this room would also fit into this paradigm here, but we can discuss that over coffee if you disagree. Another influential paradigm that should also be mentioned here, I think, is translanguaging. And translanguaging highlights how multilingual speakers often communicate by drawing on a range of resources from different named languages. Translanguaging also seeks to downplay the significance of named languages, reminding us that these are ideological and political constructions. Translanguaging has been seen as a useful way to actually move beyond these often passionate debates that flourish about whether or not English constitutes a threat. Because if named languages don't exist, if they're deconstructed into non-existence or at least to insignificance, then logically there's no language that can constitute a threat to another. Fourth and finally, the Marxist stance positions itself against the world Englishes and the English as a lingua franca stance, which it believes does not sufficiently take into account the political economy and the unequal distribution of capital across the world. A Marxist approach to global English views English as undetachable from economic resources. So this means that if you want to undo any linguistic injustice caused by English, you'd have to undo the economic injustices first. It will not suffice to make sure that speakers have the right to use their mother tongue or that they can engage in linguistic citizenship. This alone is not going to be enough to redress the economic injustice that underpins the linguistic injustice. In his recent book, Global English and Political Economy, O'Regan here argues that the reason English has been able to spread around the world is that it has enjoyed a free ride on the back of the spread of global capitalism. So he says, it is the historical connection to capital which explains in the present day the ongoing hegemony of English as the most favored global vehicular language and network good on most of the nation states and international organizations of the world, and the best candidate to become a universal language. So these are the 4 key stances to the study of global English, at least according to O'Regan. And the one that we adopt on our project probably comes closest to the Marxist one, because we assume a strong connection between the political economy and the rise of English. It would also be possible to recognize other work here by political theorists, political philosophers, economists, and sociologists. So you'll have the opportunity to listen to Abram de Swan, Felipe van Parijs, and Michele Gassola's work on this conference as well, who represent also important work in the study of global English. Okay, so how more specifically does the political economy drive the rise of English in higher education and research, which is the domain that we're all particularly interested in at this conference? Well, I've split this slide here on the drivers of English in higher education into 2. And that's to represent the idea that there's currently a bit of a disconnect between bodies of knowledge that, if combined, could shed some new light on the drivers of English in academia. One is the EMI, or English as a Medium of Instruction literature, and the other one is the literature on higher education governance reforms. So the English as a Medium of Instruction literature emerges mainly from applied linguistics, and the literature on governance reforms from fields such as higher education studies, public administration, organizational studies, political science, and others. As for the literature on English as a Medium of Instruction, Nicola Galloway effectively summarizes the literature on the drivers of EMI as such. I'm not going to read through them all, but you can have a quick skim. But as you can see from Galloway's review here, not much of the existing literature has focused or even acknowledged the role of higher education governance reforms, despite these having dramatically reconfigured the higher education sector. As for the literature on higher education governance reforms, this is a huge body of work reflecting the scale of the reform program across the sector in Europe and beyond since the 1980s. And here's just a tiny sample of it. So what we're seeking to do on our project is to explore the link between the higher education reforms and the rise of English in higher education by bringing these 2 bodies of knowledge into dialogue. Our theoretical framing then comes from adopting concepts and tools from political science, and a key analytical lens is the concept of steering at a distance. Steering at a distance is an approach to governing public sector institutions that entails the government taking a step back and granting the institutions, here higher education institutions, greater autonomy. However, and this is important, although the universities are actually granted more autonomy, this does not mean that they are free to do what they want. In fact, some have argued that there's even more control now over the higher education institutions than there was before. So in this mode of governance, the government either sets targets for the higher education institution to attain, or allocates funding, public funding, on the basis of performance or competition. The steering at a distance mode of governance is premised on a neoliberal philosophy that seeks to enhance organizational performance of public sector institutions by incentivizing them to become more proactive, more dynamic, more competitive, and more cost effective. So just to give you an example of how this works, in Denmark, universities have since 2010 been allocated public funding on the basis of 4 indicators: the number of publications that they produce, with more funding allocated to more prestigious papers, the number of students completing their studies, the value of external grants captured, and the number of PhD degrees awarded. And there's probably few academics today who don't actually feel the impact of these performance indicators in their daily lives. There's pressure to publish in high-ranking international journals. There's pressure to attract grant income. There's pressure to retain students, and so on and so forth. And the driving hypothesis of our project is that these performance indicators play a big part in driving English. And I'd like to acknowledge Michele Gazzola's work here, because he has demonstrated how bibliometric indicators actually indirectly drive scholars using English as a medium of instruction for publishing their output, or as a medium for publishing their output, rather. Okay, so here are some other terms and concepts that have been used to describe the principles of steering at a distance, just in case some of these resonate more with your own sort of experience. Steering at a distance, new public management, performance-based management, arm's length steering, performance indicators, governance by numbers, audit culture, and evaluative state. So what we'll be arguing in this presentation is that the government's reforms that are premised on this neoliberal philosophy of heightened competition for means and resources have triggered EMI, or at the very least, created a climate for it to emerge and thrive. So onto our methodology now. How do we go about researching this? Well, we will undertake one cross-European study, as well as 6 to 7 in-depth case studies. And these cases have been carefully chosen on the basis of the extent to which they have undergone higher education governance reforms, introducing steering at a distance, because we want to test the hypothesis that countries that were the first to undergo these reforms are also the ones that use more English taught programs. So the Netherlands, for instance, was one of the first nations to adopt these reforms, and coincidentally or not, is also one of the countries in Europe that offers the most English taught programs. Of course, there could be a range of reasons for this, not least the fact that the Dutch population has one of the highest English language proficiency rates in the world. So the challenge on the project then will be to tease out which variables most accurately explain or predict the rise of English taught programs. But many Eastern European countries have typically been later adopters of these governance reforms. So Peter Wingrove will be in charge of the cross-European study, and then my 3 postdocs, Beatrice, Dogan, and Marion, will each conduct case studies in 2 institutions. Okay, so to investigate the effect of steering at a distance on the rise of English in universities, we need methodologies that allow us to establish causality. Causality, of course, is a notoriously complex concept, and I can literally hear the ethnographers in the room thinking, good luck with that. But in the social and the human world, of course, there are often infinite numbers of factors that coalesce to produce certain, often unpredictable outcomes, making it next to impossible to actually point to a single cause. It works better in the physical and natural sciences, where you can develop an experimental design controlling for confounding and intervening variables. Now, although we recognize the complexities here, we're not going to give up so easily, okay? And this is where the interdisciplinary approach comes in, because we'll be borrowing from other disciplines, methodologies that will allow us to get as close as we possibly can to establish causality. So for his quantitative study, Peter will be using regression analyses and difference in difference designs, and you can talk to Peter about this if you want to know more, because he's here at the conference as well. And then for each of the qualitative in-country studies, we'll be using methods borrowed from political science called, and this is a particular method called process tracing. And I'm just going to dwell a little bit on the methodology of process tracing because it's actually quite an interesting method, I think. Theoretically framed within critical realism, process tracing is a qualitative, case-based research method that traces the mechanisms between a cause, in our case, the introduction of steering at a distance, and an outcome, in our case, English as a medium of instruction. And it does so by meticulously identifying and disentangling the mechanisms that link them. It's a method that has been likened to detective work, hence the picture of Sherlock Holmes here. So you start out by hypothesizing a causal chain and then proceeding in a way that can be likened to detective work to collect data or observables to empirically assess the validity of the hypothesized cause. So it's perhaps not surprising that this is a method that's been particularly useful to political scientists, because these people are often interested in tracing the path from a political decision and its outcome in the real world. So we'll be conducting process tracing in each of the 6 or 7 selected European nation states. I'll illustrate this for you here with one case, namely in the Netherlands. And this is not only because it seems appropriate, because it's where we are at the moment, but also because it's the work that we did first and the one that I know best, because I myself have conducted research here together with Bob Wilkinson. So we're drawing on 2 types of data, and this is typical in process tracing: documents and interviews. The documents come from both national and institutional level from one particular university whose identity is confidential, because we're interested in the interaction between the institutional and the national level in order to capture the steering at a distance approach. It's also a historical corpus spanning from 1977 to 1999, so that we can capture the rise of English taught programs over time and from the time when it actually came about. We're also conducting interviews with so-called elite participants, and this is also a typical feature of the process tracing approach. So elite participants are people that have a considerable amount of power over decision-making processes in academic governance, both at the institutional, national, and supranational level. So typically directors of international higher education organizations, ministers of education, university rectors, and so on. So I'm now going to present our emerging findings. So there is evidence of key performance indicators driving English taught programs. One of our participants, for instance, who was a member of the executive board in our Dutch case university in the 1980s to 1990s, says that a parliament-imposed target for the university to recruit 6,000 students did influence the board's decision to launch the first English taught program, which was a first-degree program in international management. And the reason why this program had to be offered in English was that the university had already exhausted the pool of Dutch-speaking students, and so the only way that they could reach the target was to recruit students from nearby countries. And in Europe, of course, where people speak different languages in different countries, this could only be done by using the lingua franca English. So he says this key performance indicators was extremely important. At the time, at the end of the 1980s to 1990s, the university had to satisfy to the second chamber, so the Dutch parliament is bicameral, a key performance indicator, which was that there should be at least 6,000 students. Very early, it became clear that that would not be the case because one had insufficient numbers of Dutch-speaking students. And so I think the English part was really essential in getting to that target, and 6,000 students was achieved in 1991, I think, or even before. So as you can see, this particular member of the University Executive Board does see a direct link between student recruitment targets that had been imposed from the national level and the introduction of English as a language of teaching and learning at the university level. And this has just been published in a special issue edited by Josep Soler and Sergi Morales. Now, this does not mean, of course, that key performance indicators and other government policies and targets are blindly followed by universities. It's not a deterministic outcome or a top-down sort of process. Another member of the executive board at our Case University was keen to point this out, saying, please don't think that government policies are blindly followed by universities. There's tension and disconnects. Joe Ritson is another participant who points to the tensions between universities and the governments. And he should know, because Joe Ritson is someone who's seen it from both sides. Ritson was the Dutch Minister of Education from 1989 to 1998, one of the longest serving ministers of education in the world, and also the president of this university, Maastricht University, between 2003 and 2011. And before I show you the quote from Ritson, I just need to contextualize it a little bit for you. So the idea of the steering at a distance approach is that the government sets targets or framework policies that are then meant to steer the direction of the university and enhance their performance. The universities are then meant to create a mission statement and report back on the extent to which they've actually reached the targets in the mission statement in their annual reports. However, Ritson told me in his characteristically charismatic way, and I couldn't quite tell whether he was actually joking or not, this. Annual reports, he said this in the capacity of his role as a president of this university. Annual reports of the universities, which have to be very specific, are not read by anyone. I tried this out by sometimes leaving pages out or putting the Ave Maria somewhere halfway in between, and no one ever noticed. Okay, so despite the fact that the ministry may not read the annual reports, the mere fact that the universities are asked to produce them is, I think, indicative of the steering at a distance approach. Now, I'm showing you Joe Ritson's photo here because he has opted to waive his right to anonymity. Because we're working with participants who have a high public profile, they will often be identifiable through their title, even if we conceal their names. So we give them the right to waive their right to anonymity on the participant consent forms. And many of them, including Joe Ritson, have chosen to do so. So when you're working with elite participants, it kind of throws the whole conventional research ethics upside down. Right, so we've seen evidence that the university board responds to national level targets, but also that it's not necessarily a response that's always straightforward or friction-free. But where in the university system do English taught programs actually originate from? Is it the institutional level, the faculty, the department, or the program level? Well, let's listen to another key figure in Dutch and European higher education governance. This is Sebold Noorda, whose positions have included President of the University of Amsterdam, President of the Association of Dutch Research Universities, Chair of the Academic Cooperation Association, Board Member of the European University Association, President of the Magna Charta University. So Noorda suggests that although English taught programs can become an official institutional policy, they actually often originate from faculty or department level. These initiatives are then seized upon or capitalized upon by the top people in the university, partly perhaps because these really important guys were under pressure from the government to be proactive and entrepreneurial. So Noorda says that at the University of Amsterdam, which he was in charge of, the senior management began to topicalize English taught programs because they were already a reality at some levels. So then English taught programs became a topic that we discussed, as in the leadership. But mainly it was discussed at faculty level by deans and directors, the leaders of the departments in their schools. So this suggests that official English medium policies may be introduced post hoc in response to a situation that is already there. It was partly reflecting the situation that was already there in doctoral studies, where there was quite an influx from abroad. So let's go back to Ritson. Although Ritson did point to the somewhat recalcitrant nature of the universities, he was immediately on board with the project hypothesis that new public management, which is the term that I used when I interviewed him, had led to English, except he didn't like the term new public management, preferring instead what he thought was a more positive term, autonomy. He said, I call it not new public management because I dislike everything which smells like neoliberalism. I'm on the right side, he wanted to reassure me. You know that, so I just want to make sure. But autonomy, that's different. That enhanced university autonomy made a huge difference. And indeed, since the Netherlands has one of the most autonomous university systems, that contributed to the Dutch taking a lead in the use of English in universities. So Ritson here is talking about a milestone reform in the Dutch higher education sector, which took place in 1985. And this was the white paper, Higher Education, Autonomy and Quality, or HOAC for short. This was a policy that spearheaded the concept of steering at a distance by increasing autonomy of the higher education institutions and putting into place accountability mechanisms. The HOAC Nota was launched in 1985, and shortly afterwards, in the mid to late 1980s, the first English taught program in our case university was launched. Coincidence or not, that's what we're trying to find out. And certainly, according to Ritson, it seems that it might not be a coincidence. We do have to be a little bit careful, of course, about our methodology here, okay? Because one of the things that process tracing has been criticized for is cherry picking. So in other words, the researcher seeks out evidence that confirms the hypothesis, also known as confirmation bias. So indeed, one of the things that was interesting in my interview with Joe Ritson was that although he was on board with the project hypothesis that new public management had led to English, or autonomy had led to English, he admitted that it was not something he himself had thought of. So he said, indeed, your combination that I had never thought about of more English and more autonomy. So this does raise the question of whether we are pushing our own worldview onto our participants and then reporting it back as evidence that our hypothesis has been confirmed. Defenders of process tracing, however, would say that no researcher ever goes into anything blind. You always have some kind of hunch about what you're expecting to find. And at least in process tracing, this hunch is made explicit for the academic community to evaluate. In our team, we do try to mitigate as much as we can against confirmation bias on the project. And we do this in different ways, for instance, by asking very open-ended questions to begin with, such as, in your view, what are the drivers of English taught programs? And also proposing alternative hypotheses, being mindful of our own blind spots. It's also very good to work in a team like this because we can challenge each other in constructive ways and make each other aware of our unconscious biases. So here is one example of our project hypothesis being disconfirmed, or at least partially disconfirmed. This is Bernd Wächter, who's also chosen to waive his right to anonymity, just like Seybold Noorda and Joe Ritson. Bernd Wächter was director of the Academic Cooperation Association between 1998 and 2021. And many of you here may also know his work on documenting the rise of English taught programs across Europe since the turn of the millennium. Bernd Wächter says, reforms impacting on EMI, English medium instruction. Yeah, you indicated, Kristina, that the drive to EMI was a lot influenced or caused by new public management. Yeah, I agree that that had an impact, but I'm not sure that it had such a big one as you appear to believe. Bernd Wächter said that there is not just one, but many drivers of English taught programs. And in fact, many of our participants believe that as well. And on the project, I think we can only agree with this, yeah? And Bernd in particular points to two key drivers. One is the commodification of higher education, and the other one is the involvement of policy actors such as NUFIC and DAD. So NUFIC is a Dutch organization for internationalization in education, and DAD is the German equivalent. So these are organizations that are almost 100% government funded, and they are members in turn of the supranational umbrella organization, ICLHE, of which Bernd was a director up until last year. So he says, our members, so NUFIC and DAD and others, have then run these marketing campaigns, study in Holland, study in Slovakia, study in the Czech Republic. And of course, they were aiming at students who would come and not be able to speak Slovak, but that they would advertise these programs in English. So what Bernd Wächter describes here is a common theme in the political science literature, namely that the state's power has dissipated in three directions: upwards to the supranational level, to policy actors such as ICLHE, outwards to national government-funded policy actors such as NUFIC and DAD, and downwards to the higher education institutions themselves, and also in countries where the governance of higher education is delegated to the regions, So in Spain and Germany, for instance, it's the regions that are responsible for the governance of the higher education institutions. So I would actually argue that although Bernd was not immediately on board with the new public management hypothesis as a single explanation for English taught programs, the drivers that he does point to, commodification and multi-level governance, can also be interpreted as a result of the government taking a step back in favor of other policy actors steering the higher education sector. So because of steering at a distance reforms, it is the case that a multitude of policy actors have entered the higher education governance scene, leading to a dynamic interaction between the supranational, the national, and the institutional level. And another participant who confirmed this was the ex-Minister of Education in Finland, Olli-Pekka Heinonen. He was recommended to me as a participant by Joe Ritson because Joe Ritson said that those two, along with some other European ministers of education at the time, had actually been quite proactive in pushing the universities in their countries to adopt English taught programs. So I asked Olli-Pekka to confirm this when I interviewed him. I got the impression from Joe Ritson that the idea of English taught programs had initially come from the national level and that it had been pushed on to the institutional level by the ministers of education. Is that an accurate representation? I would say so, that it is an accurate statement, but at the same time, I am sure that I can find that sentence in the OECD recommendations in our higher education policy. And I'm sure that those kinds of discussions that happened at the time on the European Union level also had an impact on the national policy. So Olli-Pekka here talks about the role of the supranational policy actors such as OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the European Union also influencing national policy. This idea of policy borrowing, which is also a key concept in the political science literature, is something that Joe Ritson picks up on as well. So this is Joe Ritson again, this time wearing a different suit. He talks about steering at a distance reforms and says that Denmark did the same thing. We did it in the Netherlands some 10 years earlier. And I felt also I could contribute a bit to the Danish changes by being on OECD committees, which propagated this. And later the Danes actually took over quite a bit of the Dutch legislation. So as a way of trying to sum all of this up and bring us to some sort of conclusion, two additional concepts from political science have proven to be useful, and that's multi-level governance and policy borrowing. So although I've focused on the nation states in indirectly driving English taught programs here in this presentation, it's difficult, very, very difficult to pinpoint the exact origin and cause of English as a medium of instruction, not least because these different levels, the supranational, the national, and the institutional, interact in what one of my postdocs, Marion, now has called an interlocking system. And it's also interesting to think about where the model of new public management governance actually originates from before it started in the European sector. It has been argued that it's something that originally comes from the Thatcher and Reagan era in the 1980s, from where it was then uploaded to the supranational level as a template of governance. And from there, it was then downloaded by individual European countries and implemented as a reform program in the different European countries. Policy borrowing also happens because many of these individuals here, or the elite participants, tend to occupy multiple positions in higher education governance. We've seen many examples of this in this presentation, and also because they know one another, okay, and sometimes become chummy and exchange ideas with one another. And this brings us on to the conclusion. So in this presentation, I presented teamwork that brings tools and concepts from political science, notably the focus on governance, states, and institutions, to linguistics in an attempt to shed some new light on how and why English comes about in higher education in Europe, and potentially also beyond, because many countries across the world have undergone similar reforms. It's very difficult, as I've said, to pinpoint the exact origins of these reforms and of English taught programs, not least because the national, the supranational, and in the institutional level interacts, and also because even within the institution, it can come from both program level, department level, faculty level, and individual level. But despite this interaction here, it is difficult to get around the fact that these changes all originate from the nation states having put into place the political and legal frameworks that have reformed the higher education sector, and that this has in turn, if not caused English as a medium of instruction, then at least created an environment in which it can emerge and thrive. So what can we use this information for? Well, in contrast to most explanations that have focused on supranational drivers of English as a medium of instruction, we have pointed to the role of the active role of the nation state in introducing governance reforms. And I would suggest that this is knowledge that is worth having, because it gives us as enfranchised citizens in our respective demos more autonomy or more agency as to how our universities should be governed, and also the linguistic ecology within them. Of course, I'm under no illusion that both steering at a distance and English taught programs are now so entrenched that it's likely to be irreversible, even if it did turn out that through democratic processes, the majority of us would want to abolish it. However, I would suggest that at least having this information about the role played by the nation state in driving language shift may help inform the often passionate debates about this, bridge disconnects between different stakeholders, identify the factors that underlie linguistic injustice, and perhaps serve to open up some more serious discussions about how we want our universities to be governed and what the nature and purpose of universities should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristina. We're running a bit short of time. I can allow one